How World War I changed Europe forever. The First World War was more than a military conflict. It was a turning point that reshaped Europe's political map, destroyed centuries-old empires, transformed societies, and altered the way people thought about war, government, and human life itself. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe was no longer the confident, imperial continent that had entered the war in 1914. The changes were so deep that the modern history of Europe cannot be understood without them. The collapse of empires. Perhaps the most visible transformation was the disappearance of four great empires. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires all collapsed under the pressure of total war. In their place emerged a collection of new nation-states: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Borders were redrawn according to the principle of national self-determination, promoted by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Yet these new borders were rarely neat. Millions of people found themselves living as ethnic minorities in unfamiliar countries. Germans lived in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Hungarians were scattered across Romania and Yugoslavia. Arabs were placed under British and French mandates instead of receiving independence. These unresolved national tensions would fuel conflicts for decades and help pave the road to another world war. The Treaty of Versailles and political instability. The peace settlement of 1919 aimed to prevent future wars, but instead created deep resentment. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the conflict, pay enormous reparations, and surrender territory and military power. Many Germans viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliation imposed by the victors. Across Europe, faith in traditional monarchies and liberal governments weakened. The Russian Revolution of 1917 inspired communist movements, while fear of Bolshevism encouraged the rise of radical nationalism and fascism, especially in Italy and Germany. The war had convinced many that the old political order was incapable of protecting ordinary people. Social transformation. World War I mobilized entire societies. Over 65 million men served in uniform and around 10 million died. The scale of loss created a lost generation of young Europeans whose absence scarred families and communities. Women entered factories, offices, and public services in unprecedented numbers to replace men at the front. This experience strengthened demands for political rights. In the years after the war, women gained the vote in Britain, Germany, Austria, and several other countries, permanently altering gender roles. Class structures also shifted. Aristocratic prestige declined as common soldiers had borne the heaviest burden. Trade unions grew stronger, and governments accepted greater responsibility for housing, employment, and welfare. The idea that the state should protect citizens from poverty and unemployment gained new force. Economic upheaval. The war devastated Europe's economy. Industrial regions in France and Belgium were physically destroyed. Railways, mines, and farmland lay in ruins. Governments were heavily in debt, particularly to the United States, which emerged as the world's leading financial power. Inflation ravaged savings, most dramatically in Germany, where hyperinflation in 1923 wiped out the middle class. Britain and France struggled to recover their pre-war dominance, while the global economic center gradually shifted away from Europe. The financial weakness of the 1920s made the continent vulnerable to the Great Depression that followed. Cultural and psychological impact. The brutality of trench warfare shattered the optimistic belief that European civilization represented progress and reason. Writers and artists such as Erich Maria Remarque, Wilfred Owen, and Otto Dix portrayed war as meaningless slaughter rather than heroic adventure. Traditional values were questioned in literature, philosophy, and art. Memorials to the dead appeared in every town and village, turning remembrance into a central part of European culture. The experience also encouraged new international movements. The League of Nations, pacifist organizations, and early ideas of European cooperation, though these proved too weak to stop future aggression. Military and technological change. World War I introduced industrialized killing: tanks, airplanes, submarines, poison gas, and machine guns. Warfare became a contest of factories and resources rather than individual bravery. Governments learned to control economies, censor information, and organize propaganda. These methods would later be used by both democratic and totalitarian states. The Long Shadow. The most tragic legacy of World War I was that it prepared the ground for World War II. Unresolved national questions, economic misery, and the bitterness of the peace settlement allowed extremist leaders to promise revenge and renewal. Adolf Hitler's rise to power cannot be separated from the defeat and humiliation Germany experienced in 1918 to 1919, the rise of new ideologies. The shock of the war created fertile ground for powerful new ideologies. Liberal democracy, which had seemed triumphant before 1914, now appeared weak to many Europeans. In Russia, the Bolsheviks proved that a small, disciplined revolutionary movement could seize power and build a completely new social order. The creation of the Soviet Union in 1922 offered an alternative model based on communism, atheism, and state control of the economy. Workers' parties across Europe looked to Moscow for inspiration. At the same time, a very different response emerged on the political right. Fascism promised national unity, strong leadership, and revenge against those blamed for defeat. Benito Mussolini in Italy and later Adolf Hitler in Germany used the frustrations of veterans, the fears of the middle class, and hatred of the Versailles system to build mass movements. These ideologies were direct children of the war. Without the trenches, the refugees, and the economic collapse, they would have struggled to attract support. Changes in international relations before 1914. Europe had been dominated by a balance of power system managed by a few great empires. After the war, this system was gone. The League of Nations was created to replace secret alliances with collective security and open diplomacy. Small states were given a voice in international affairs for the first time. However, the League lacked its own army and depended on the cooperation of major powers. The United States chose not to join, and Germany and the Soviet Union were initially excluded. As a result, the new international order was fragile from the beginning. Europe had entered an age in which global cooperation was necessary, yet trust between nations had been fatally damaged. The human landscape. After the war, Europe in 1919 was filled with wounded bodies and wounded minds. Millions of veterans returned home with missing limbs, damaged lungs, or shell shock, what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. Governments had to invent new systems of pensions, hospitals, and rehabilitation. The sight of disabled soldiers in city streets was a constant reminder of the cost of modern war. Refugees were another new phenomenon. The collapse of empires forced whole populations to move. Greeks and Turks exchanged homelands. Armenians fled persecution. Germans left the Baltic region, and Jews from Eastern Europe migrated westward. These movements made European societies more mixed, but also increased prejudice and competition for jobs and housing. Science, medicine, and technology. The war accelerated scientific development. Medical advances such as blood transfusions, plastic surgery, and improved treatment of infections saved countless lives in the decades that followed. Aviation, radio communication, and chemical industries expanded rapidly because of wartime research. Yet technology also revealed a darker side. Poison gas, aerial bombing of cities, and submarine warfare showed that civilians were no longer safe behind the front lines. The boundary between soldier and non-combatant had been blurred, changing the moral rules of conflict forever. Memory and the politics of remembrance. How to remember the war became a central question for European nations. France and Britain built grand monuments celebrating sacrifice and victory. Germany developed a more divided memory. Some mourned the dead, while others spoke of betrayal and demanded revenge. These competing memories shaped politics and education throughout the interwar years. Annual ceremonies such as Armistice Day created a shared culture of mourning, but they also kept national grievances alive. The phrase "never again," repeated across the continent, expressed both hope and fear. Europe was haunted by the knowledge that civilization itself had nearly destroyed itself. Toward a new Europe, by the late 1920s, some Europeans attempted to build cooperation out of the ruins. Intellectuals proposed a United States of Europe, and economic agreements tried to rebuild trade. The idea that European nations were interdependent slowly took root. laying distant foundations for the European Union many decades later. Nevertheless, the wounds were too deep to heal quickly. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, struck societies that were already unstable. Democratic governments collapsed one after another, and by the 1930s, much of Europe was ruled by dictators. The promise of peace made in 1919 was fading. After 1918, European governments understood that the survival of their nations depended on shaping the minds of the young. Schools became places where the meaning of the war was taught and debated. Textbooks in France and Britain emphasized sacrifice, heroism, and the defense of civilization. Universities also changed. Thousands of former soldiers entered higher education through new state programs, bringing with them practical experiences and political passions. Academic fields such as economics, psychology, and international relations expanded as scholars tried to understand why the catastrophe had occurred and how it might be prevented. Education became more democratic but also more political. Transformation of art and literature. No area of European culture remained untouched. The elegant realism of the 19th century gave way to darker and more experimental forms. Movements such as Dadaism, Expressionism, and Surrealism rejected traditional beauty and tried to express the chaos of modern life. Artists who had witnessed the trenches believed that old styles were incapable of telling the truth. Writers across the continent produced some of the most powerful works of the modern age. Novels like All Quiet on the Western Front and poems by Wilfred Owen described fear, mud, and pointless death rather than glory. This literature created a shared European language of mourning and doubt. The war generation questioned religion, patriotism, and even the idea of progress that had guided Europe for centuries. The changing role of religion churches had supported the war effort in 1914, blessing soldiers and promising divine protection. After the slaughter, many believers felt betrayed. Attendance declined in several countries, and secular ideologies gained strength. At the same time, some people turned to religion for comfort, producing a revival of spiritual movements and charitable organizations caring for orphans and widows. The moral authority of traditional institutions was therefore weakened. Europeans increasingly looked to the state, rather than the church, for solutions to social problems, accelerating the growth of modern welfare systems. Colonial consequences. Although the fighting was centered in Europe, the war transformed European empires overseas. Britain and France used soldiers from India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, exposing colonial subjects to European weakness and to ideas of self-determination. After the war, many veterans returned home demanding rights equal to those of Europeans. Germany lost all its colonies, and the Ottoman Empire was divided into mandates controlled by Britain and France. These decisions planted the seeds of future independence movements in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Europe's global dominance, once unquestioned, began a slow decline. Law and human rights. The horrors of the war encouraged the first serious attempts to create international rules protecting civilians and prisoners. War crimes trials were discussed, and new conventions on the treatment of the wounded were adopted. Although these efforts were limited, they marked the beginning of modern human rights thinking. The idea emerged that governments could be held accountable to universal standards, not only to their own laws. This principle would later influence the creation of the United Nations and the European Convention on Human Rights after 1945. Everyday life in the 1920s. For ordinary Europeans, the post-war years were a mixture of relief and hardship. Cities filled with new music, cinema, and consumer goods imported from America. Young people enjoyed greater freedom in fashion and relationships, symbolized by the flapper culture and the popularity of jazz. Yet behind the excitement lay anxiety. Housing shortages, unemployment, and political street violence were common. Families mourned relatives whose bodies had never been found. The contrast between modern pleasures and unresolved grief gave the decade its restless character. Looking ahead. By the early 1930s, Europe stood at a crossroads created by the legacy of World War I. The continent had learned to mobilize economies, empower citizens, and imagine international cooperation. It had also learned how easily fear and nationalism could destroy democracy. The final judgment on how the war changed Europe depends on which path is remembered: the path toward dictatorship and another global conflict, or the slower path toward reconciliation and unity that eventually produced a peaceful Western Europe after 1945. Both roads began in the trenches of 1914. World War I was therefore not simply an event, but a revolution in European civilization. Its echoes can still be heard in modern borders, in social rights, in art and memory, and in the continuing effort to build a continent where such a tragedy can never happen again. The transformation of democracy. One of the most complex results of World War I was its effect on democracy. In 1914, only a few European states had full democratic systems, but by 1919, many new constitutions promised universal suffrage, free elections, and civil rights. Germany created the Weimar Republic, Austria and Czechoslovakia adopted parliamentary systems, and even traditionally authoritarian states experimented with broader political participation. However, democracy was born in an atmosphere of crisis. New governments were expected to solve impossible problems: war debts, unemployment, housing shortages, and the reintegration of millions of veterans. Because these states were associated with defeat and hardship, many citizens quickly lost faith in them. The war had expanded political rights, but it had also raised expectations that fragile institutions could not meet. Veterans and the culture of violence. The return of millions of armed and traumatized men created a new social force: the veteran generation. Many former soldiers felt alienated from civilian life and believed that only comrades who had shared the trenches truly understood them. Across Europe, they formed leagues and paramilitary groups. In Germany, the Freikorps fought communists in the streets. In Italy, the Black Shirts attacked socialist organizations. In Eastern Europe, armed bands influenced elections and border conflicts. Politics became militarized, and compromise seemed like weakness. The habits of war, discipline, obedience, and the acceptance of violence entered everyday political life. Economic nationalism and protectionism. Before 1914, European economies were closely connected through trade and investment. The war broke these links. Governments had learned to control prices, production, and labor, and many continued these policies afterward. Countries raised tariffs to protect their industries and tried to achieve economic self-sufficiency. This economic nationalism deepened rivalries between states. Instead of rebuilding a shared European market, nations competed for scarce resources and colonies. The United States and Japan benefited from this division, while Europe gradually lost its position as the workshop of the world. The redrawing of Eastern Europe. The greatest changes occurred in the East. The old imperial borders had contained dozens of ethnic and religious communities living side by side. The new principle of nation-states assumed that each people should have its own country, but reality was far more complicated. Poland included Ukrainians, Jews, and Germans. Yugoslavia united Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes with very different histories. Czechoslovakia contained large German and Hungarian minorities. Governments attempted programs of assimilation, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. Minority conflicts, border disputes, and population exchanges became permanent features of the region and remained unresolved until the end of the century. Women after the war. Although women had contributed enormously to victory, peace did not simply return them to their previous roles. Many wished to keep their independence and wages. New professions opened in teaching, nursing, clerical work, and journalism. Fashion and social behavior became less restrictive. Political leaders could no longer ignore women's demands. The right to vote was granted in numerous countries, and female representatives entered parliaments for the first time. The war had not created full equality, but it had broken the belief that public life belonged only to men. This was one of the most lasting and positive European transformations. Health and demography. The human cost of the conflict continued long after 1918. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920 spread partly by troop movements, killed millions more. Birth rates fell sharply, creating demographic gaps that affected labor markets and family structures for decades. Governments responded with new public health systems, child welfare programs, and campaigns against disease. Modern European states became more involved in the physical well-being of their citizens, linking national strength to healthy populations. Conclusion of Part 4. By examining politics, society, and everyday life, it becomes clear that World War I was not an interruption, but a foundation for the Europe that followed. The war released forces, democratic hopes, nationalist hatreds, social reforms, and economic fears that continued to struggle with one another throughout the 20th century. Europe after 1918 was a laboratory in which new forms of government, culture, and identity were tested, sometimes with creative energy and sometimes with disastrous results. The continent's later achievements and tragedies alike were rooted in this formative moment. To understand modern Europe is to recognize how deeply the First World War entered its institutions, its memories, and the hearts of its people. World War I was the first conflict fought in the age of mass newspapers, film, and radio. Governments quickly learned that controlling information was as important as controlling armies. During the war, they created ministries of propaganda to shape public opinion, encourage enlistment, and demonize the enemy. After 1918, these techniques did not disappear. They became permanent tools of politics,